You think the 1970s was all avocado green kitchens, shag carpeting, and loud wallpaper? Think again. Hidden behind those funky colors was some of the most creative and budget-friendly cooking America has ever seen. These weren't fancy chef creations. These were real recipes served to real families, born from a decade struggling with inflation, gas shortages, and skyrocketing grocery prices. Today we're digging into 25 forgotten ground beef classics that kept American families fed, comforted, and coming back for seconds, even when money was tight. And if you love these trips into America's forgotten food history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next culinary time capsule. A Depression-era survivor that came roaring back when beef prices shot up 30%. A single pound of ground beef could feed 6 people, and this dish made that miracle happen. You'd brown the meat in a cast-iron skillet, whisk in flour to make a golden roux, then splash in milk until it thickened into a silky, peppery gravy. Poured over buttery mashed potatoes, it tasted like warmth, comfort, and survival. This wasn't just dinner, it was proof that mom could still stretch the budget and keep everyone fed with dignity. Today's fancy, elevated comfort food wishes it had this kind of soul. No porcupines, just rice. When the uncooked rice poked through the meatballs as they simmered, it looked like tiny white quills. Church potlucks, PTA dinners, neighborhood gatherings, everyone had their version. Ground beef mixed with rice, onion, and egg, rolled into balls and simmered in tomato soup, always Campbell's. Fresh tomatoes cost too much. As the rice swelled inside, it created a texture somewhere between a stuffed pepper and a soft meatloaf. It was American ingenuity at its best. 2 cheap ingredients turned into something special. If the 1970s had a national casserole, this was it. Ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and those golden crowns of frozen tater tots. Simple, iconic, and engineered for hungry families. Brown the beef, spread it in a dish, smother it in condensed soup, and top it with a perfect grid of tots. 40 minutes later, you had bubbling, creamy beef beneath a crunchy potato crust. Every church basement potluck, every funeral lunch, every neighborhood gathering, this dish showed up. Not fancy, not complicated, just pure American comfort. Hungarian chefs would faint at the name, but American families loved it. Brown ground beef with onions. Add elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. Everything cooked together in one skillet, the pasta absorbing all those beefy, tomato-rich juices. Green peppers if you had them. Corn if you didn't. Cheese on top if payday was recent. This was the smell of home, the sound of a wooden spoon tapping a cast-iron pot, and the definition of weeknight survival cooking. When food prices spiked, cabbage became a hero, 15 cents a pound and capable of expanding any meal. Beef browned with onions in that avocado green electric skillet everyone had. Thick chunks of cabbage tossed into wilt and caramelize in beef drippings. A splash of Worcestershire. A shake of pepper. Maybe tomatoes if the budget allowed. Cabbage transformed into sweet, silky ribbons filled with savory flavor. With a slice of buttered white bread, this became a full meal for under $2. To nutritionists today, a healthy one-pan meal. To 1970s families, just making it work. Before the boxed mix arrived in 1971, moms were already making this from scratch. Ground beef sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, garlic powder, never fresh garlic, too fancy, elbow macaroni, beef broth or bouillon, and ketchup or tomato sauce all simmering together until the pasta absorbed every drop of flavor. A handful of cheddar at the end made it melty, gooey, and irresistible. It was fast. It was cheap. Fed everyone. That was the promise of the 1970s kitchen. A name straight out of church cookbooks. Layer ground beef, sliced onions, sliced potatoes, kidney beans, and canned tomatoes. Cover with foil and bake until everything softens into a saucy, comforting mess. It wasn't pretty, but it stuck to your ribs and fed a whole table on a tiny budget. Every one of these dishes carries a story, not just of taste but of American resilience. Families didn't have food networks, meal kits, or farmers market organics. They had whatever was on sale, whatever fit the budget, whatever could stretch, whatever could feed 5 people with 1 pound of beef. And from that, they created meals that warmed the home, filled the house with savory smells, and brought families together around the table. These weren't just recipes. They were the taste of a generation doing its best through hard times. That if you enjoyed this trip back into America's forgotten kitchens, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because we've got decades of lost recipes, forgotten traditions, and untold stories to uncover together. Shipwreck casserole earned its place on 1970s dinner tables through pure culinary boldness. Only in that era could someone look at ground beef, crushed potato chips and condensed soup and think, yes, let's bake this. The result was divisive, yet irresistibly popular at potlucks from Texas to Michigan. The process was simple. Brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup formed the creamy base. That mixture went into a casserole dish, ready to be transformed. Then came the infamous step, an entire bag of crushed potato chips scattered throughout and piled generously on top. Cheese was optional but almost always added, usually the pre-shredded orange kind that defined 1970s convenience. After baking, the chips turned into something magical. The ones on top stayed crunchy and golden, while the ones inside softened into salty, starchy little pockets filled with creamy beef flavor. Every bite was a mix of textures, crispy, creamy, meaty, and wildly indulgent. Nutritionists of today would faint, but in the 1970s, processed foods represented modern progress, not danger. Chipwreck casserole embodied that optimism. Someone in the 1970s eventually realized that meatloaf took too long to bake, but muffin-sized portions could cook in half the time. That simple insight birthed the wildly popular meatloaf muffins. They were perfect for families constantly bouncing between errands, school activities, and Tupperware parties. The mixture was familiar: ground beef, breadcrumbs soaked in milk, diced onions, eggs, and enough ketchup to give it the signature sweet tang. Instead of shaping a giant loaf, the mix was scooped into greased muffin tins. In just 25 minutes, each mini loaf developed its own caramelized crust, a feature traditional meatloaf only achieved on the edges. Kids loved the individual servings, and parents loved the speed and the ability to freeze extras for emergency meals. As they came out of the oven, each muffin was brushed with a ketchup brown sugar glaze that turned sticky, glossy, and slightly charred. Served alongside instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans, it was the definition of efficient 1970s cooking, a decade that didn't slow down so dinner couldn't either. Then came the beef and biscuit ring, a recipe that looked impressive enough for company but was secretly simple enough for a busy Tuesday night. It became the darling of the 1970s homemaker era, a dish that offered maximum visual impact with minimal effort. Brown ground beef seasoned with onions and maybe a handful of corn or green beans for color formed the filling. Meanwhile, refrigerated biscuit dough was arranged in a ring on a baking sheet, overlapping piece by piece to create a connected circle. The beef mixture went into the center, and the biscuit edges were folded partially over it. After baking, the ring emerged golden and flaky, with the savory filling peeking through the center like a retro edible centerpiece. The biscuits soaked up the meat juices, turning tender and flavorful without becoming soggy. This was the essence of 1970s cooking: clever shortcuts that produced impressive results with no apologies necessary. Porcupine rice bake took the concept of porcupine meatballs and made it even more convenient for the growing number of working mothers during the decade. Instead of shaping individual meatballs, the mixture, ground beef combined with uncooked rice, onions and seasonings, was pressed into a casserole dish. The baking liquid, often tomato soup thinned with water or tomato sauce mixed with beef bouillon, soaked into the rice as it cooked. Covered baking allowed the rice to swell and poke through the meat like tiny quills. Uncovering the dish for the final minutes created a golden, slightly caramelized top that added depth and texture. Served with garlic bread or a simple green salad, it was a hands-off meal that made the cook look far more put together than they probably felt while juggling work, chores, and children. Beef jambalaya bake represented another 1970s trend: America's growing curiosity about regional cuisines, filtered through Midwestern practicality. Traditional jambalaya took hours to prepare, but the 1970s were all about streamlining. Ground beef was browned with bell peppers, onions, and celery, though many households swapped fresh vegetables for dried onion flakes to cut costs and time. Canned tomatoes were added along with rice, and then came the unmistakable 1970s touch: a packet of Lipton onion soup mix for seasoning. Everything went into a casserole dish with water and baked until the rice softened. The result wasn't authentic Louisiana fare, but it was hearty, spicy, and different enough to feel adventurous. For families who had never been anywhere near the Mississippi River, this casserole was a culinary road trip served on a weeknight. Hamburger biscuit bake offered yet another clever partnership between ground beef and refrigerated biscuit dough. This version layered everything inside a casserole dish rather than forming a ring. Browned beef mixed with cream of mushroom soup and maybe frozen vegetables became the base. Biscuit dough, torn into quarters, was scattered across the top like a rustic cobbler. Buttered tops dusted with garlic powder elevated the dish from simple to special. As it baked, the biscuits puffed up into buttery golden pillows while their undersides soaked in the creamy meat mixture. Every bite offered a contrast of textures, crispy tops and velvety, gravy-soaked bottoms. It was comfort food science executed with supermarket ingredients. Mock prime rib patties highlighted the decade's fascination with mock dishes, recipes that mimicked luxurious meals using inexpensive ingredients. True prime rib was too expensive during the recession, so families created their own budget-friendly version. These patties weren't ordinary hamburgers. Mixed with breadcrumbs, garlic powder, Worcestershire sauce, and the essential secret ingredient, liquid smoke, they aimed for steakhouse flavor on a tight budget. Formed into thick patties and seared until crusty, they were dressed in a sauce of condensed mushroom soup thinned with beef broth or cheap red wine. Served with roasted potatoes and canned asparagus, these patties brought a sense of occasion to the table. No one was fooled into thinking it was real prime rib, but that wasn't the point. It was about dignity, celebration, and making something feel special even when money was tight. Beef and potato hash casserole tapped into the 1970s trend of breakfast for dinner. Ground beef replaced corned beef hash, and frozen hash browns replaced hand-shredded potatoes. Brown beef mixed with hash browns, sour cream, cream of celery soup, and cheddar cheese formed a fast, hearty base. A topping of crushed cornflakes mixed with melted butter added crunch. After an hour in the oven, it smelled like Saturday morning but tasted like weeknight comfort. The contrast between crispy edges, creamy potatoes, and savory beef made it a dependable favorite. Families sometimes topped it with fried eggs, embracing a decade that increasingly ignored traditional food rules. If it tasted good and saved time, it was fair game. Beef tamale pie brought American families a simplified, corn-forward cousin of shepherd's pie. Beef browned with onions, corn, peas, and homemade gravy formed the filling. Mashed potatoes, instant or leftover, blanketed the top and were decorated with fork ridges for better browning. A pat of butter on top melted into the potatoes, creating a golden crust. Cutting through the top layer into the bubbling beef below was deeply satisfying, and the whole dish fed a family for just a few dollars. Hamburger spoon-bread casserole blended Southern tradition with Midwestern practicality. Spoon-bread, part cornbread and part pudding, became the perfect partner for seasoned ground beef. Cornmeal batter was poured over the meat mixture, baking into a golden, slightly crisp top with a soft, spoonable interior. The layers melded into a comforting blend of textures, like cornbread dressing mixed with a casserole. It was familiar and new at the same time, perfectly suited for a decade that loved experimentation as long as it was simple. Finally, homemade sloppy joes remained a point of pride despite the popularity of manwich. Ground beef browned with onions and peppers created the savory base. Ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, Worcestershire sauce, vinegar, and tomato paste simmered together into a thick, tangy sauce that clung to every crumble of meat. Served on soft buns that immediately started to fall apart, sloppy joes were messy on purpose. Paired with chips and pickles, they made weekend lunches unforgettable and brought families together without any need for fancy presentation. 1970s ground beef classics. Rewritten in 900 words, beef enchilada casserole was the Midwestern remix of a Mexican classic. Deconstructed, simplified, and rebuilt for Tuesday night dinner. Instead of rolling individual enchiladas, everything was stacked in layers like a cheesy, saucy lasagna. Ground beef browned with a packet of taco seasoning, Old El Paso or Lori's, whichever lived in the pantry, formed the base. Canned enchilada sauce followed, mild enough for picky kids. Corn tortillas were cut into strips and layered with beef, refried beans, and mountains of cheddar cheese, because authentic Mexican cheese was nearly impossible to find in a 1970s supermarket. Baked until bubbling, the tortillas softened into something between noodles and chips. Topped with shredded lettuce, canned black olives, and a spoonful of sour cream, it brought Mexican-inspired flavor to families who had never stepped foot in a taqueria. Not authentic? Not even close. Beloved? Absolutely. Hot on the casserole heels of the enchilada dish came the beef and bean burrito bake. Another ethnic dish filtered through Midwestern practicality. Burritos were loved, but rolling 10 of them after a long workday was not. The solution? Turn them into a layered bake. Ground beef with taco seasoning mixed with canned pinto or refried beans created a hearty filling. Some cooks rolled the filling into flour tortillas and arranged them in a pan. But the lazier, more popular version simply layered tortillas, meat, cheese, more tortillas, more filling, and finally enchilada sauce plus even more cheese. The result was like a Tex-Mex lasagna, soft, saucy, and sliced into perfect squares. It showed up at potlucks, church dinners, and neighborhood gatherings, always disappearing first. This was cultural borrowing, casserole style. Stuffed peppers had existed for generations, but the 1970s gave them a weeknight makeover. Bell peppers sliced lengthwise became edible boats, parboiled to soften them. The stuffing combined brown ground beef with cooked rice, usually minute rice, canned tomato sauce, onions and whatever seasoning a household trusted, garlic powder, oregano, maybe an Italian seasoning packet. The peppers baked upright until tender, their edges slightly charred, the filling bubbling. A generous sprinkle of mozzarella melted during the last 10 minutes turned each pepper into a self-contained meal. It looked classy, tasted hearty, and fit the decade's mission. Fast, affordable, family-friendly cooking with a vegetable pretending to be the star. Sometimes a simple sloppy joe wasn't fancy enough, which is how sloppy joe pie was born. The beef mixture stayed familiar: ground beef, onions, ketchup, Worcestershire, brown sugar and a splash of vinegar, but instead of spooning it onto buns, it was poured into a casserole dish. Then came the magic: a thick layer of cornbread batter on top. As it baked, the cornbread rose into a golden crust, absorbing just enough beef juices to become moist and savory. What emerged looked far more impressive than the ingredients suggested. Served with canned green beans or a quick salad, it made families feel like they were eating something special, even when the budget said otherwise. The name says everything. Shipwreck casserole wasn't planned. It happened when payday was far away, the pantry was half empty, and creativity was the only ingredient left. Ground beef was stretched with canned vegetables, tomato soup or cream soup. Onion soup mix added flavor when fresh onions were out of reach. But the true glory was the topping: crushed potato chips baked into a crunchy golden crust kids would fight over. Born from desperation, it became a classic because it tasted like comfort, survival and childhood all at once. Even when money improved, families asked for it again, proof that necessity can create legends. Long before TV dinners turned it into a rubbery punchline, Salisbury steak was a proud dish of thrift and skill. Housewives stretched a pound of ground beef with breadcrumbs, milk, eggs and seasonings, shaping the mixture into oval patties that resembled miniature steaks. Pan-fried until browned, they were set aside while onions caramelized in the same skillet. A rich brown gravy was created by stirring flour into the drippings, then adding broth. The patties simmered in the sauce until tender. To kids it felt like steak night. To parents, it felt like making luxury out of very little. This was working-class ingenuity served on a plate. This dish was almost certainly an accident. Someone staring at a bag of stale corn chips and refusing to throw them away. The solution? Turn them into a casserole topping. Ground beef seasoned with chili powder or a taco packet mixed with canned beans, corn and diced tomatoes. The mixture was topped with crushed corn chips and cheese, then baked until the chips crisped and the cheese bubbled into a golden shell. It tasted like a taco casserole, a nacho bake and a budget triumph all at once. Served with a simple lettuce and tomato salad, it made an ordinary Wednesday night feel like a celebration. In the 1970s, ketchup wasn't just a condiment, it was practically its own food group. Ketchup-glazed meat patties took the concept to the next level. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, eggs and seasonings was shaped into thick patties. Each patty was topped with a glossy mixture of ketchup and brown sugar before baking. As they cooked, the glaze caramelized into a sticky, sweet, tangy coating that tasted like every childhood dinner wrapped into one. Served with instant mashed potatoes and frozen peas, it was the kind of meal that defined an era. Simple, fast, satisfying, and unapologetically saucy. Ketchup-glazed meat patties. Ketchup-glazed meat patties were proof that the humblest ingredients could create a dish that tasted far more luxurious than it cost. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, an egg, and a few everyday seasonings. Simple building blocks found in every 1970s kitchen. But the real magic came from the glaze. A mixture of ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire, it transformed plain patties into something that looked slow-cooked and expensive. The glaze caramelized as the patties baked, forming a glossy mahogany coating that was sweet, tangy, and savory all at once. Paired with mashed potatoes and green beans, this dish turned an ordinary night into something that felt like Sunday dinner, without stressing the family budget. Rag-mop casserole. Rag-mop casserole earned its unusual name from the tangle of noodles woven through the dish, resembling the strands of an old rag mop. It was quintessential resourceful cooking, born from using leftover or broken pasta that might otherwise be thrown away. Ground beef was browned with onions, then combined with mismatched pasta shapes: broken spaghetti, elbow macaroni, or the end of bag egg noodles. Canned tomatoes and tomato sauce formed a hearty base, while cream of mushroom soup added richness and held everything together. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were growing in the backyard, it baked into a bubbling, comforting casserole. If families added cheese on top, it became even more irresistible. Leftovers only improved as the flavors melded, turning scraps into something warming, filling, and deeply satisfying. Midwest meat pie. The Midwest meat pie was the definition of comfort wrapped in practicality. It stretched a modest amount of ground beef into a meal that fed the entire family. Ground beef was combined with diced potatoes, carrots, peas, and onions, whatever vegetables were available in the season. Encased in a homemade pie crust made from flour, shortening, and water, the filling baked beneath a golden top crust that sealed in all the moisture. As it cooked, the meat juices soaked into the bottom crust, creating a delicious layer that tasted almost like a beef gravy. Each slice was its own complete meal, easy to portion and perfect for busy weeks. Many families made multiple pies ahead of time, freezing them for nights when cooking from scratch wasn't possible. Practical, nourishing, and comforting, it was farm country efficiency at its best. Beef and potato casserole. This classic beef and potato casserole was a throwback to simpler times, before viral recipes and gourmet trends took over home kitchens. It was built from basic staples: brown ground beef layered with sliced potatoes and a creamy sauce, finished with a generous blanket of melted cheese. There was nothing fancy about it, and that's exactly why families loved it. It was hearty, filling, and required minimal effort: just stack, bake, and serve. It filled the kitchen with the kind of nostalgic aroma that made you think of grandma, comfort, and cozy evenings by the TV. In an era obsessed with superfoods and gluten-free alternatives, this casserole quietly slipped into obscurity. But for those who grew up with it, it remains a symbol of simple, affordable, crowd-pleasing cooking. Beef tamale pie. Inspired loosely by the ancient Mexican tamale, tamale pie was a mid-century American creation that blended familiar Tex-Mex flavors with easy-bake casserole convenience. Traditionally, tamales were masa dough stuffed with meats or sweets and steamed in corn husks, a technique that required skill and time. American cooks reimagined the concept with ground beef simmered in chili sauce, topped with a thick layer of cornbread or masa mixture. Over time, the recipe evolved into a hearty casserole that could include beans, corn, olives, cheese, and peppers. No one knows exactly who invented it, but many believe it originated somewhere between Texas, New Mexico, and California. What's certain is this: tamale pie delivered bold, comforting flavors without the hours of labor real tamales required. Hamburger soup. Hamburger soup always inspired a double take from anyone hearing the name for the first time. But once people tasted it, they understood its charm. Ground beef simmered with onions, celery, carrots, potatoes, and a rich broth created a hearty soup that felt like eating a burger and fries in cozy, winter form. Tomato sauce or diced tomatoes added a tangy depth, while barley or pasta could stretch the dish even further. It was one of the most budget-friendly ways to feed a large family, and the leftovers tasted even better the next day as the flavors melded. Warm, filling, and endlessly customizable, hamburger soup became a cold-weather staple for households across the Midwest and beyond. Beef chili. Beef chili wasn't just a meal, it was a tradition. Ground beef, beans, tomatoes, and chili powder created a bowl that was hearty, spicy, and comforting on even the coldest days. Though Texas chili purists insisted on no beans, the rest of America embraced the bean-filled version for one simple reason: it stretched the meal and made it more filling. Every family had their own version, and Grandma's recipe was usually the best: simple, balanced, and perfected over decades. Like many dishes on this list, chili tasted even better the next day. It was the ultimate one-pot meal for parties, gatherings, or busy weeknights, and remains one of America's favorite comfort foods.